Jing being a 5-star character of the lightning element residing in the path of erudition. He holds the title of having the most interesting story in all of Star Rail because since his debut, he has been the most controversial character. Some swear by him and others want nothing to do with him. He's a character that would have been a simple fix in other games, but ended up being a cash cow in this game. What's important to note about Jing is that we can take a look at his development from his debut banner to where he currently sits in Honkai Star Rail as a bunch of mini balance patches or pseudo buffs. In other words, this video will be structured differently. For the most part, he has received an indirect or direct buff in almost every single patch to date. Serval was a 4-star lightning erudition damage dealer, and while she played a huge role in Jing's history, it was very short-lived. Now, considering most players would have this character built all the way into the endgame, and many of those enemies in the endgame being weak to lightning, she found herself having a high utilization. I mean, after all, her only competition was a 4-star that was heavily gutted before the release of the game. Serval will not appear on any of the launch banners as their featured 4-star, so getting additional copies of this character was heavily gated by RNG. To say the least, some were very lucky in maxing her out just around the time Jing's banner would arrive. In the second half of patch 1.0, Jing would release as a second limited character, and second damage dealer of that category. Right off the bat, he would find himself being compared to Seal because she was the only benchmark to run off of. Considering most of Jing's damage as an erudition character was centered around his Lightning Lord and single target scenarios, the comparisons only grew. It did help that most of the enemies early on were weak to lightning, but some of those enemies had a ton of crowd control, which is very important to note for later in the video. Now, one thing you have to understand is despite Jing being a character that is an erudition path, at the time in Honkai Star Rail, there really wasn't any content for erudition characters to shine in, and I'll explain this more later on in the video. How Jing managed to break expectations was no mystery, as he had the best setup upon his arrival. Everyone that had a fully invested to Serval would see Jing being an upgrade no matter how many copies you had on her, or so we thought. There would be a crowd of people that truly believed, despite Jing being a powerful damage dealer on his release, was not better than an E6 Serval. The only reason why people believe this, because he was already undesirable to play because of his backloaded damage mechanic, there would be another issue that played into his backloaded damage, and that would be Jing being heavily susceptible to crowd control effects. If Jing was CC'd versus other characters, and say your action was delayed to go after the Lightning Lord, your Lightning Lord would not take action, resulting in a massive DPS loss. It's one thing to miss a crit on Seal, but to deal 0 damage in a turn would be the main reason why people couldn't be bothered to use him. At this point, both sides would go back and forth on why Jing was an amazing character despite his issues, and others would claim an E6 Serval to be competitive to him. One thing's for certain, Jing, unlike Seal, didn't have many supports to help alleviate the issues in his kit, and following the release of Silverwolf, Seal will become a lot better as a damage dealer. To play devil's advocate, Jing would receive a pseudo buff in the same patch as did Seal, because the second half was the introduction of Luocha, who not only gave Jing more skill points to support his greedy team comp alongside Asta, but also provided a cleanse for Jing passively. If you lucked out and were hit by the enemies that had a ton of crowd control in the end game, you were typically around half health, which would proc Luocha's cleanse and heal. The release of Luocha would also bring another thing, insight into what would be a slow upward trend of Jing as a character in general, no pun intended. The following patch would bring not only 2 more characters, but funny enough, one of those characters would end up much like Serval. Kafka, upon her release in the second half of patch 1.2, would be compared to Jing because the reality of the situation is that damage dealers with matching elements are linear as it gets in a turn-based game. Despite functioning differently, many people would redeem Kafka to be better than Jing as an AoE lightning damage dealer. There are a few things you must consider about this point in time. Kafka had the flavor of the month in that being the content favored her at the time, and she was extremely flexible with her teams. Not only could you play her in a damage over time team, but in a traditional hypercarry setup as well. All of these things coupled with being easier to build in terms of not needing any crit stats, she would be a character that many would prefer over Jing at the time, and this notion would continue on until we would continue on to patch 1.3, which would bring quite a few changes to Honkai Star Rail overall. I consider patches 1.2 to 1.4 to be the Great 3, because all of these would contain a damage dealer of the destruction path that made erudition feel lackluster in comparison, Blade being the least of that bunch. Denheng and Baby to the Nai would release in the first half of patch 1.3, and upon his release he would absolutely shake up the meta and show the true power of a limited damage dealer. Despite being a different path and element altogether, Daniel would nuke everything in his sight. Now around this point, overall mob health pools were much lower, and a lot of those same mobs had imaginary weakness. He also paired especially well with Luocha, whom was a character that Jing preferred at the time. I mean, everyone wanted Luocha really. I remember at the time of Daniel, missing out on the damage deal this strong made you feel as if you were playing a different game altogether. On the brighter side, the second half of this patch contained a best in slot support for Jing, who even to this day is a mainstay in his hypercarry team comps. Fu Xuan was an amazing defensive option. Not only did she give a ton of damage mitigation, but she also had a ton of utility to give her selling power over Luocha. 12% critical rate boost and crowd control blockage that lasted indefinitely until the enemy would inflict any or everyone with a crowd control effect during that enemy's turn. One of the strongest abilities in the game hands down. This would be perfect synergy for Jing, because having a refreshable auto cleanse essentially attached to a skill point positive support meant that the Lightning Lord had every tool it needed to ensure it would land an attack every single turn order cycle. Much like Luocha, pretty much everyone wanted Fu Xuan because of her amazing kit, but for Jing especially, this would be the biggest direct buff if we factor in their relationship and the lore as well. After patch 1.3, Jing would continue its uptick in utilization and overall placement in the meta. Things were looking very bright for the general. Following the release of patch 1.4, things would begin to seem a little interesting to say the least, because this upcoming character would be what I considered the weakest limited character upon their debut. Jinglu did release in the first half of 1.4, but by this point, no matter how overloaded she was as a damage dealer, most Jing mains would stick to their favorite character as a default, because Fu Xuan really did help them feel much like a better character. Topaz would release in the second half of patch 1.4, and as I said earlier, would be the only underwhelming character on debut. Topaz could dish out a decent amount of damage while remaining skill point positive and buffing follow-up attacks. Jing's Lightning Lore was considered to be follow-up and was the largest portion of damage for the character in lesser mob scenarios. However, Topaz could only buff that amount up to 50%. Despite counting as a different multiplier, these two would be a decent pairing, as Lightning Lore could only act once per cycle, which meant for Topaz, she wouldn't receive much of a performance boost as much as Jing did. I normally don't talk about Eidolons for 5 stars, but an Eidolon 1 with Signature Light Cone Topaz was considered to be the best buffer for Jing, because on top of the follow-up attack boost she gave, she would also give a massive crit damage boost against that same enemy with the follow-up attack debuff she placed on them. However, many would consider this to be the realm of pricey and unnecessary, so most Jing mains would stick with a base Topaz and traditional hypercarry setups. Funnily enough, some would argue that Ting Yun and Asta would perform better than Jing versus replacing Ting Yun in that same team comp. So far, Jing has received a pseudo change or shakeup in star rail every single patch, and 1.5 was no exception. Huo would release in the first half of patch 1.5 and was actually a decent upgrade over Fu Xuan for Jing. The reason being that Huo gave a ton of cleansing, the most of any character yet, and a lot of healing additionally. The selling point of Huo over Fu Xuan, however, would be the attack and energy she would give to the whole team upon usage of her ultimate. Not only could Jing appreciate those very solid combat buffs, but Ting Yun, who directly skid off of attack and gave energy upon ult, did as well. If you also use Topaz, then she would directly benefit from the attack and energy as well, increasing her DPS in the team by a nice margin. While Fu Xuan gave a nice critical rate boost, she sometimes couldn't stop every bit of crowd control, especially in current star rail. And some players at this point, depending on how much investments their Jing had, would have nice crit ratios. This patch, however, most would just skip Huo as a Jing main, because they had to devote a ton of Trailblaze power to what would be the first legitimate buff to Jing. There would be a brand new relic set that would not only buff the fall attack damage of the user, but also gave a massive attack increase as part of the passive, which also gave Lightning Lord a huge boost in damage, and would be a massive upgrade over Jing's old and dusted lightning set. This patch would also solidify Kafka as a damage over time character, with a different playstyle because funnily enough, the opposing relic set in the domain of Jing's would be best in slot for dog characters, and those same characters benefited from Huo more as well. Really solid patch overall. Anya would release in the second half of patch 1.5 alongside Argenti as a 4-star, but unless you had her at high Eidolons, she wouldn't be a massive upgrade in Jing's team alongside Topaz, because Ting Yun was just that strong for the general. I already stated this in the dedicated Hanya video, but she really should have been a launch character. She released at the worst time possible. Argenti to release in the same patch, just in the second half, was the second limited erudition character. A long time coming at that point. Upon his arrival, he gave insight into how a character in the path should operate, because unlike Jing, he had no glaring issues. Patch 1.6 would bring further buffs for Jing with the release of Ruan Mei. Not only was his character a mainstay in every player team comp in the game, but she also made the dual DPS team setup with Topaz a much better team overall. Having a character buff everyone on the team with damage boosts, speed buffs, and resistance penetration allowed everyone to feel as if they were contributing to the overall team damage. That's what made Ruan-Mei so special. Even in hypercarry, you no longer need an Asta, as Ruan-Mei gave better buffs, personal damage, and a skill point generating playstyle unlike Asta. At this point, you would think that Jing's teams felt established. It no longer needed any more assistance, because not only was this ridiculously expensive, but it also meant that Jing didn't necessarily have a dedicated support still. It wouldn't be until the following patch where that would come to fruition. But before we do discuss that, there's something you also need to understand. As I've been editing the video, I forgot to mention that Jing is actually a lot better with the release of Pure Fiction, which is the newest game mode Hoyoverse added for the in-game contents on Honkai Star Rail. Much like Herta in the video we talked about her becoming a top tier character, Jing also saw a lot of increase in utilization based on this game mode being catered to erudition characters, and in combination with Ting Yun in the same team party and with the further release of Sparkle, he became a staple in this AoE styled Unga Bunga content. Dr. Ratio would be given for free to the player in the second half of 1.6. Considering he was a single target damage dealer of follow-up attacks in his kit, Topaz would become one of his best teammates and vice versa. This meant that you would ideally never use Jing alongside Topaz because the synergy wasn't as strong as the aforementioned combo. And this also meant that Jing still at this point didn't have a dedicated support for his hypercarry team unlike everyone else. Jing main suffered from essentially being strung along by Hoyoverse, with the slow teas of supports being better suited each following patch for Jing, and it wouldn't be until the upcoming patch where we can finally say he's good to go. Patch 2.0 would bring a huge shakeup to Honkai Star Rail's meta, because not only was Sparkle on the way, but Black Swan was in the same patch, which meant that Kafka mains would rejoice once again. It always fascinated me how these two lightning damage dealers always end up toe to toe in the same patches. In the second half of 2.0, which leads us to present day Star Rail, would be the release of Sparkle. Sparkle would essentially be a Bronya that worked with everyone, because she had a trace that would allow backloaded damage to take advantage of the crit damage she provided on top of the massive damage boost and further attack boost she gave to the damage dealer. For Jing, this was a game changer, and he would go on to become a much more complete character overall. And I'm sure every current Jing main is satisfied with his position in the meta. Now there is two last things worth mentioning. Akadon is going to release in the upcoming patch at the time of my recording of this video, and we all know how Hoyoverse treats their beloved Purple Lightning child. Will she be a better damage dealer than Jing? Only time will tell. All I can say for certain is that if Hoyoverse learned anything from Jing, it's better from a financial standpoint to string along the players with buffers and supports than just giving that character their best support on debut. Don't hate me for saying this. We all know what's going to happen. Oh, and one last thing I want to mention. Robin was drip teased not that long ago also from the time of my recording of this video. She may end up being an even better support for Jing's hypercarry or dual damage dealer setup teams. Again, only time will tell if this stands true. If she has anything to do with giving energy, then things will become especially hectic. So there you have it. The history of Jing was actually the most fun video I've worked on yet. Not only was it a refresher, but it also made me realize how susceptible we consumers can be to FOMO. Thank you for watching, and have a nice rest of your day. Peace.